Next, we will actually see the tables in Overleaf, right? Tables are also pretty much famous in Overleaf because we have different sort of tables here, right? And different ways to actually make such tables. So our environment actually starts with our class article, right, as we are using till yet, and there are three packages which you can see right here. All of your packages will be listed here as I have told earlier, right? Like the book tabs and long table and float. So floating actually provides you an environment like where do you want your play tables to be placed, right? For example, here top, bottom, left, and all, right? Where you want your table to be placed, something like that is actually your float environment, right? Long table is another package which is actually for your tables like these, which have a lot of entries and which spans multiple pages, like this, right? So long table is actually for same. And then you have the begin document and end document, which is actually there to actually start and end your document. That's all what we have for your document, right? So essentially there we are just making your title by just providing your title like slash title, and then whatever content you actually provide will be actually written in the title section, like define different types of tables, right? And there comes our first section, right? Like basic tabular, non-floating, right? So what's the most basic table you can actually make in Overleaf is something like this. That is with tabular. So you actually start your table with slash begin tabular and end your table with end begin end tabular, right? So what happens is that then you defines the columns of your table, right? Like L C R, right? So L stands for left, C stands for center, and R stands for right. So it defines the alignment of the content of your table. For example, you can see here in this particular column, the A and D are aligned towards left, C and F are aligned towards right, and B and E are aligned towards center, right? And what happens to the particular top things, right? Left, center, and right. So these actually happens here, right? So these are just the labels of these particular columns, right? And what happens is that how you fill up data like these in your table, you just separate them with ampersand, right? Like left ampersand center ampersand right, right? And what happens with this, these two symbols are used to actually separate one particular row with another one, right? And you can see that the line is actually appearing here but not below. That's because of this h line, right? H line defines this particular horizontal line of your table, right? And so your table is actually starting with a horizontal line and then another horizontal line and ending with a horizontal line. So this is how you define your table, right? With these different horizontal lines and particular columns, right, which are separated. Now let's see, if you don't want to actually mark your boundary of your columns, then what happens? We just remove this particular bars, right, here, and then it will actually compile and tell you, um, yeah, and then you can see that these two bars are actually removed. So you can see this bar was actually for the same purpose for this particular line, and this particular line we have these bars. So again, putting these particular bars here, we will be actually getting our desired table, right? Essentially, yeah, we got that. And then we have this all representing a particular basic table example which you can have in Overleaf, right? So this is the most basic one. This doesn't use any of the top rule or floating things up, right? In the Overleaf, just simple alignments of left, right, and center. Then what happens is that a floating table, right? So you have this begin tabular for the simple table and begin table for a floating table, right? Along with the caption, right? So what happens is that you actually define your begin table and inside it you actually define your tabular. That's the difference, right? So begin table actually defines an environment in which you can align, right? And begin tabular is actually your normal standard table which you were using here. So again, the centering stuff slash centering actually tells that place this particular table inside in the center of this particular document like this, right? You can say here, right, that this particular table is actually in the center, right? So this is whole space and this is actually in the center. And the particular thing like this one, right, a standard floating table is actually inside section, so it is coming on top of this one, right? So now what actually happens is that inside this particular begin table, you have HTBB. Now what happens is that H stands for here, right? It says that if it is possible to place this whole table here only, where I'm actually defining, just place it here. Right? Otherwise, if it is not possible here, then you actually just place this particular table on the top, right? And then there you have the B for bottom and P in a similar fashion, right? So basically, it actually defines the priorities that where you want your table to go. Because what happens when you actually put a lot of text and content in your whole project, then what happens is that you don't get the space for your whole table to get. So they define the priority that wherever possible, just put the particular table there, right? And you can also put a not symbol, right? If you want strictly your table to be there, like not H, right? And then again, we are defining LCR, L for left alignment, C for center, and R for right alignment. Now what happens is that now you are not using the H line, right? Horizontal line you are not using, right? So what happens is that now you are using the top rule, right? This particular line is actually called the top rule. This is actually called the middle rule, and this is actually called the bottom rule, right? So what happens is that it's a cleaner way to define these particular lines, and these tables are pretty famous in the research, right? So these things, as the previous session, we as the previous table are actually in the same fashion, are being separated by ampersand, which separates different entities in a single row. And then these particular two symbols actually defines the row ending, right? Names a city and then row ended with these two particular symbols. And then we have the mid rule, which defines between the headings and the content. And then we have these entries, right, which defines the content. Now we have the bottom rule, which defines the ending. And also after that begin tabular, earlier you were not able to give a name to your table, but now you are able to give the name to your table by using the caption. In the caption, we are defining the caption such as sample data, and in the label, you are defining a label which you can refer with slash ref, which we were doing earlier, right? So see, table slash ref and table sample, whatever you define here, you actually refer with that, and whatever number it gives to the table, automatically that number will actually come here. Whenever you change the position of the tables, the number will be updated. Now the third table is actually the long table, right, or the multi-page table. What happens in the long table is that in the similar fashion which we were starting earlier, we will actually define our long table with the slash begin long table, right? So we are defining a two-column table, right, in which we have the left alignment column and the right and the center alignment column, which is value. Now this is actually slash h line, right, which is actually for the horizontal line to actually start our table, and then we have the headings of item and value. Then we have the H line to be actually giving the margin after this particular heading, right? This particular line. And then we have an head, right, which is just ending the head of this particular table, right? Why it is necessary just to define where the head is actually there, so that whenever it will actually span multiple pages, the head will actually come to the next page also. Then we actually define the multiple entities of one and one, something like in this fashion, right? And then separated by these backward slashes to actually separate the different entities of the entries of this particular table. And then slash h line for the horizontal entry, which defines the end of the table. Then we have the slash caption, right, which define the caption, right, like long table example, right, which actually gives the name to this particular table, and end a long table to actually define the ending of this long table, right? So this is how we actually define a long table, which can actually span multiple tables. This can be useful to you if you have multiple entities to be shown, right? Now we actually are with the example of say table, white table with the wrapping of the text, right? This one is actually what you have the text, and you want it to wrap within a particular boundary, because you see earlier whatever we defined, the column was defined by the content which we actually put in. For example, in this particular table, if we define a lot of content, right, like this one, right, right, which can be a particular case when you have a lot of text in a particular column of this table, right? So you can actually see right here we have a lot of content right here, and the table will actually span too much. That's actually bad for some cases. So actually define strict width of the particular column by using something like this table, right? So you actually define P for that same, right? So you actually begin your table with begin table, H for here, that you want to put your table here only wherever you are defining, slash centering for centering your table, and begin tabular for actually starting to define your table. And then in between the column boundaries, you are defining a paragraph column with 3 centimeters. So this is exactly 3 centimeter of the column length, and they have the C, right, for centering environment. Then whatever you define will be actually limited to 3 centimeter of width, and then you can separate your entries with these two backward slashes. Then you can define your caption with slash caption and your table with end table. This is how you can actually define tables, and these are four such examples of table in Overleaf.